Hello and welcome everybody to the fifth episode of Opposite Treks. Joining us today, the one and only Star Trek communist Wil Wes. Will, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, man. Introduce
Happy
yourself.
happy to be here, and man, I really love that intro.
Thank
Um,
you.
I love synth wave and chill wave music. That's right up my alley, and
Oh, so much.
love that baseball and the teacup. Like clearly, TNG DS9 fans, so that's great.
Hugely DS9 fans. And the rest of the crew is gonna love that you said that. But thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
Thank you. We love to have you. Welcome. Today, I'm just trying to get it all sorted out. We are talking to Wil Wes about a few things, specifically, is Star Trek a communist utopia, a communist ideal? And he belongs to an organization which he will explain and some of his philosophies. But welcome, Wil. If you can tell us a little bit about yourself, go ahead, man.
Sure. I'm a simple fan of Star Trek. I actually love cosplay and going to conventions as much as I can. It's a little more difficult now with the family, but try to go to conventions and obviously, love watching all iterations of Star Trek. Obviously, I have my favorites. I think TNG Deep Space Nine are my favorites. Lower Decks
Yeah,
as well, but everything from TOS, the animated series, the new Treks, there's all great stuff in them, right? But we have our favorites, but there's also something that is great about that rich universe. So, like, I was a Star Trek fan before I became a communist, before I became a revolutionary Marxist, and it was a natural fitting in terms of
yeah,
the world that's postulated in Star Trek. How do you get there? Is it just supposed to be this
yes.
dream that's unattainable, or how do we get there? And then on top of that, is the Star Trek world perfect? Even though it's better than the one that we have right now, is it perfect? And maybe if it's imperfect, doesn't invalidate the premise? Or like, how do you make sense of that contradiction too? And there's a way to make sense of that as well. So I think it naturally kind of fit in, like my two interests kind of fit in naturally um, because of it. So
That's awesome. That's so great. Thank you. Um, yes, so you found your way to this moniker, being the Star Trek communist. I want to tell you why I was super happy to have you here. I'd interacted with you before briefly, just online. I was super jazzed that you had, and having had the show, which was based on the idea of the Federation being an insidious monster, as my cousin Mo would say. Uh, and me defending the Federation as being benevolent and wonderful for the galaxy.
mhm.
Inevitably, we talk about political philosophy. And so, what I wanted to ask you, I mean, amongst the many things, and why we're going to get there, as you described it, a dialectical materialism, the back and forth, the sharpening of that conversation, is why you chose communism as your framework, and how is it different than other types of socialism that we see, obviously, in the Federation. Um, because I agree with you in many respects that a communist ideal might be typified in Star Trek, but not necessarily exactly what we see. And so, for me, I wanted to put it to you why you chose communism as your framework. Let's start with that question.
Sure. I think I chose it because it's the end state as laid out in Marx and Engels' work, the Communist Manifesto, where they explain back in 1848. Um, but it's obviously even more resonant and more relevant now that communism is a stateless class society, that the distinctions that divide us in society, which is primarily on a class basis, but one class oppresses another class, keeps another class down, doesn't exist, right? And as a result, because class distinctions, class antagonisms don't exist, you don't need a state. A state being the mediator
Yeah.
between different warring classes, right? To make sure one is dominant over the other when there's still a period of inequity, when there's still a period of antagonisms.
Right.
And that's the end stage. Socialism is a transition stage between capitalism
Okay.
and communism, right?
I see.
Socialism is defined as it's a worker state. The working class is in control of society. They have a state that is actively trying to ameliorate the class antagonisms, develop the productive forces even further, provide for people in a way that begins to get to a point where there are no longer any class differentiations That's
Right.
going to take some time because capitalism has wrought itself over a period of time. It has brought a lot of misery and
Yeah.
equity, so that has to be reversed. Not it won't happen overnight. So it needs to be, how does that transition stage happen? That's what socialism means: the working class being in control, the working
Right.
class owning the means of production, get to a
Yes.
point where it could wither away. But Lenin wrote about the withering away of the state, when the state no longer needs to serve a function, which would be a workers' state, as opposed to a capitalist state, which is the current state of affairs right now, is that the capitalists have their state. It's called the government. It's called the
Right.
United States government. It's called the Canadian government. It's called every other government that's based upon
Yes.
the capitalist mode of production, which is they have a state that backs it up. And the state, Lenin defined it simply as the armed bodies of men, is what the state is in its final analysis. That means the police and the military. At the end of the day, that's what the state represents. It represents the force to protect and preserve the property relations as it is right now. So
Interesting.
socialism is the understanding that the workers, to overthrow the capitalists and to maintain their power, they need their own state to basically create and stabilize the conditions to allow communism to happen, to allow the state to eventually wither away, that people would join freely in organizations, freely
Yeah.
associate, freely develop, freely innovate, all those types of stuff without coercion,
Right.
without a standing entity
Yes.
above it. But how do you get there? There's a continuum. And before
Agreed.
capitalism, there was feudalism. And before feudalism, there was the slave, institutions of like Rome.
Slave
Right?
master
Before that,
dynamic, definitely.
right. And before that was like hunter-gatherers, right? So
Right.
history is the development of the productive forces and its development of the class struggle. That's kind of the Marxist view of history. And it's
Okay.
why communism is basically kind of the end goal.
Right. So, I mean, based on what you're saying, and what I would argue now, all of my friends who are watching who would argue with me and say, well, okay, there's a stagnation. We're in end state capitalism. There's all these buzzwords of like how the world actually like operates now, and what corporations and like governments are doing. Right? I can't remember if that's the definition of fascism or not, but they're riding in the same cart. And I'm a big fan of Frank Herbert and Dune. It's like this idea of like politics and religion in the future, and an understanding of science that is manipulated. It seems to me that this stagnation has led to a kind of culture that has led to a kind of a vacuum of like morals and ethics that maybe we would have had, and the idea that corporations can be people, that we can treat them with the same respect as a human being, that human life isn't really like respected in the same way. Again, you're living in America, and I'm from Canada, so we have a Western like philosophy. And I'm on the other side of the world. I'm in Abu Dhabi. I'm seeing a whole other like perspective, this Eurasian, global, Southern perspective of how like minerals are being like pulled out of the ground, how these in a world of socialized abundance, like in the Federation, where so many things are replicated, it seems like very easy to find hierarchies and structures that are more like lateral. Whereas right now, the only way that we can think of as working as stuff that we've inherited, this is also something you would find in like evolutionary biology and evolutionary systems, where they're built on top of one another, adapted over top of one another, rather than like going towards the best energy state or the best state. They're piled on top until the detritus is pulled away. You can say that's like cutting off the heads of the French emperors or whatever, and then starting over. But that stagnation is left because we don't do that anymore. We don't have casual murder in our society. So how do we sort of describe where we're going in the Star Trek world versus the real world in your framework?
Right. So, so a great example of this actually is I was just reading an article, I think yesterday, about Amazon and about Alexa. So Alexa, as everyone should know, I think it's like the voice recognition system. Hey, hello Alexa. How many eggs does it take to bake this cake or something, right?
Yeah.
And the article was basically about how much money Alexa is losing for Amazon. Like Amazon's losing a lot of money with Alexa and the voice recognition system that it built. The reason why it's losing a lot of money and why Amazon and a lot of other tech companies are doing a lot of layoffs all of a sudden is because they were Amazon specifically was betting that we're going to sell the machines, Alexa, kind of at cost or maybe slightly below cost, just to get all of this stuff in people's kitchens, their living
Right.
rooms, what have you, right?
Sure.
The idea being that if it's there, we can sell you stuff easily. They can just say,
I
hey,
hear
I
you.
want Amazon Prime
Yes.
and I'm going to buy stuff. They wanted to get those impulse buys, you just buy by audio. And that was the big bet at that time. And that's why Alexa was be able to proliferate. It was pretty affordable, pretty cheap, more or less. And it was really cool to get that a lot of technological advancement to kind of get the software and the algorithms to work. A lot of engineers working on that. And yet now they're thinking about maybe potentially spinning off Alexa or cutting off support for it because they found that people were just using it for quote unquote utilitarian purposes. They were saying they were looking things to turn off the lights, get directions, find the music that they wanted, what the weather is, helpful things, right? But they weren't actually going on Amazon Prime to say, hey, I want to buy me a new lawnmower or buy a new Blu-ray set or something, right? So Amazon's bet that they could commodify this thing turned out to be false. So now they're like, wait a minute, we developed this amazing technology, but we can't monetize it. We can't get people to just basically subsidize our warehouse operations and our moving stuff, right? So it has become a liability, right?
Mm.
That is the insanity of the capitalist mentality at this late stage of the game, where this is actually a productive advancement. This is amazing human technique, human ingenuity, human engineering to design basically the voice controls, the voice commands in Star Trek, right? That's great, right? But instead of seeing it as an advancement to say, hey, we can do this now, instead of manually typing it in, going somewhere, we can verbally do it. The profit motive, private ownership, shareholders demand that say, you know what, that is not enough. We didn't do this out of the goodness of our hearts. We did this to get people to buy more junk they don't need. So they can't commoditize it. So that's the difference. The difference is under socialism, under a planned economy that meets human needs, you would allocate resources to meet people's needs and then actually have the rest available for genuine innovation,
Yes.
genuine scientific discovery, genuine advancement, not considering whatsoever the profit motive of a small minority, their shareholders, those that own stocks or whatever, right? And that's how you advance. That's why scientists got into science to begin with. That's why engineers became engineers. They wanted to solve things. They wanted to build things. They wanted to figure things out. They didn't want to grow up and be like, I'm going to make sure I'm going to build the next great thing so that we can sell stuff to people on an online platform that used to be a used bookstore for some dude. So that's not why people became engineers or they became scientists. They became that because it was lucrative up to a certain point. But now it's turning into its opposite, which is what dialectics is all about, understanding how things are constantly in motion and can turn into their opposites. Same thing, I read the same article about Google, how Gmail is actually costing them a lot of money because Gmail is incredibly ubiquitous, but they can't monetize it really. But it's so ubiquitous that they can't get rid of it without having tremendous pushback because there's Gmail accounts everywhere, but they're losing money of it. And that is the insanity of the capitalist mode of production. They develop it, but if they can't make a quick buck off of it, they'll say it's not worth it anymore. And that's the tremendous squandering, the tremendous waste.
Agreed.
So that's the argument that we say, wait a minute, are you saying we can't actually have a better society? We can't actually develop the means, the technical know-how to build a better society? We already have it. It's merely in the hands of a small minority. Right? The capitalist class, the ownership class, those that own private property, if it was to be under workers' control, democratic workers' control, based off of a nationalized or international mode of production that's planned, you could meet people's needs. We have tremendous know-how, but it's squandered because you can't make money off of it. So that's how you get to the Star Trek future. You want to build the Galaxy class enterprise, you want to build the Constitution class enterprise. Under capitalism, what's the monetary value of that? Do they have sponsored ads on the enterprise that just built by Amazon, built by Meta, built by Google. No, they just built it, right? And they are literally designed to just go out and explore space. They have, the Galaxy class ship is like a virtual flying city. They have huge be the equivalent of like entire neighborhoods, city blocks devoted towards science, engineering, and then specific types of science like astrometrics and like, botany, and they have the arboretum, right? All of this type of stuff devoted towards just exploring, developing human knowledge. But if this was under capitalism, they would be like, that sounds like a lot of money and not a lot of return on that. And that's not even getting to the fact that, do they charge for healthcare? Like, do the doctors, Dr. McCoy, Dr. Crusher, Dr. Bashir, they don't charge when they heal someone, right? They don't check, hey, does this person have Federation health insurance? Like, they don't do that, right? So that's kind of the connection that I make, is like, the only way you get there is you eliminate the profit motive, which is just basically the unpaid wages of the working class. You have to eliminate private ownership, and you have to eliminate capitalism, which means you have to have a socialist revolution.
That's amazing. I mean, so, when I was younger, one of the phrases that came out was, the revolution is here, the revolution is coming. And I'm sure before that, we didn't know as young people that generations of people had always talked about the revolution is here, whatever. It was then commodified. And later I found the irony of wearing Che Guevara t-shirts to be adorable and infuriating. So I understand, I think most Star Trek fans, I don't mean to be superlative, but the ones who really care, who actually care about the ethical and moral quandaries, which are typified in TNG, especially when it comes to these economic sort of understandings of how our society works, are frustrated with the vision of our current leadership in this actual plane of existence, this world now, as opposed to the one that's in this like future. And then they sort of become disillusioned when they don't see the real world steps. In America, I try to follow American politics as well as I can, because it, of course, affects the world, and the idea of liberalism and conservatism and social democracy and all these things. What's not being done is, before maybe it was less obvious, but now it's much more obvious that nothing is being done on purpose, because the stagnation of Congress, the stagnation of those peoples, actually helps enrich those who already in positions of power. There's more of a classist differential than ever before. And we're seeing, especially as a Canadian, let me say, before we have socialized medicine, we have socialized like government or whatever. There's more and more talk and rhetoric of becoming more and more capitalist. It's creeping up north. Definitely part of our society and our culture was that we had no culture, and we bid on your style as Americans, and we took that. And part of that, what we've inherited as well, is the toxicity that comes with the economic system that you've cultivated. And as I said, like through evolution, it's not that we can just reach this better point. You build on top of the other things. To destroy it all in one heap is I don't think they can picture it in the same way. So as a Star Trek fan, specifically, of course, like watching the Bell riots in 2024, we saw it in Picard recently in that episode. We're visiting this type of like sanctuary city in San Francisco. My goodness, it's coming true. We're seeing it in San Francisco. How do we, as Americans, we're both Westerners, how do we take steps to sort of bring that Star Trek utopia? And is communism a framework that'll allow for that dialectic to be sharpened in the direction that we want? And how do you know that that's the direction that we want?
Sure. So the question of what do you do, right? What is to be done was a question formulated by Lenin in his book, What is to be Done? It was also formulated by Leon Trotsky, who was another Bolshevik revolutionary, who talked about the crisis of the world right now is a crisis of the leadership of the working class. So what does that mean, right? It means that there's tremendous anger in society. You see it all the time. And there are periods where it may seem a little quiet. There's no upsurge. And then bang, there's an explosion.
Yes.
And then people, are fed up. And yet then it quiets down again and nothing seems to inherently change. This process is playing back and forth over time. all the time. But none of the
Very true.
contradictions in society are resolved. So how do you get out of that? Because on some level, there are some that do recognize that. And that's how people are, that's why some are very alienated. They're very cynical. They're like, I used to think like you. I used
Yeah.
to believe in revolution. I grew up in the 60s and 70s. I knew. And then you know what? Nothing happened of it. Can't do anything. You just have to make the best out of it. Vote for the lesser evil, blah, 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 blah. Right? They're
Yes.
all naive, right? There's because that cynicism becomes very pervasive and becomes very poisonous.
Agreed.
But where does that come from, right? It comes from the fact that the leadership of the working class, which is basically the heads of the large labor unions, the trade unions, the
Yes.
NGOs, what have you, right? They don't want to go beyond the limits of capitalism because they got a nice job, they got a nice gig. And that's actually very prevalent in a lot of countries in the United States, but also in Canada. The leaders of the New Democratic Party, the NDP, Jagmeet Singh, they don't want to go beyond capitalism. That's why they say, hey, let's vote
Wow.
for, vote in alliance and push the liberals further left, right? I try to follow Canadian politics too because it does feed on each other, right?
Does.
Because politics is international. There are no borders. And it goes
Yes.
back to the idea of workers of the world unite and nothing to lose but your chains. The distinctions of society, the national borders, they're actually a fetter. Capitalism is dependent upon hard national borders in the sense that, you know,
Yes.
that's how you divide the working class and you get them to go against their own interests and how you compete against each other, right? And
Yes.
that's why you see the instability in society. It's how you explain the situation in Ukraine, explain the rising tensions with China, is that every of these capitalist classes, ruling class in these countries, they're in crisis and they want to export the crisis of capitalism onto their competitors. And then they'll wave the flag really hard. So they'll wave the jingoism. They'll go to the nationalist route. They'll go the racism route. Whatever is to distract the workers to say, hey,
Right.
those workers over there aren't like you. They're
Right.
more evil. They don't deserve that. We got to fight them, right? As opposed to the central distinction is the class question, right? Is that you have more in common with a Chinese worker. You have more in common with a Mexican worker, a Pakistani worker, a Ukrainian worker,
So true.
a Cuban worker, a Venezuelan worker. You share the same class interests. But
It reminds me of Paulo Freire. I don't know if you know Praxis, the
yeah,
philosophy of praxis. Yeah.
yeah,
Like taking your philosophy and putting it into action. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
no, yeah,
I just
absolutely. And the perspective is to make that clear, right? But the leadership of the working class don't want that to happen. They just say, hey, we can get you a better deal if we just work within the institutions as is. We don't need to struggle. We don't need to call for a general strike. We don't need to call up for work stoppage. We just want to just elect somewhat better politicians, although they're not better. It's basically just a bad cop, good cop routine. That's how in the United States,
I know.
that's how the politics work here, and it works actually in other countries too, because that's how
Agreed.
the bourgeois, that's how bourgeois democracy survives. Lenin talked about bourgeois democracy as it's the most advanced shell of capitalism. It's the most effective way for the capitalists and the bourgeois, those that own property, can rule because they confuse people. They give people the illusion of choice, and they do a good cop and a bad cop. Sometimes they give you a little bit in order just to kind of get you to calm down. They'll get you to kind of go back home, get off the streets, don't protest, right? But it's a good cop, bad cop routine, right? And that's exactly how the working class should view the Democrats and the Republicans. It's exactly how they should view the liberals and the conservatives, the Tories and Labor. They should view that as it's a ruse, right? They want you just to think you have a say in these elections that are very formalistic. And then they give you the illusion of choice so that you go back to just producing for them, right? Producing and consuming for them, right? But you have the quote unquote formalist, you voted for these two prescribed parties that basically agree on most things. They agree on private property, they agree on capitalism, they agree on imperialism, they agree on the police, they agree on all sorts of stuff, right? They'll give you some concessions here and there, though, but the overriding defense of the status quo, which is defense of the property relations, right? Business interests. That is what capitalism is. That's why Lenin said, in reality, we live under the dictatorship of capital, But in the advanced capitalist countries, it's hidden
Yes.
under this shell of bourgeois democracy. But as long as the banks get to continue to be the banks, and as long as private property and private ownership is left unassailed, then it doesn't really matter. Then it doesn't really
Yeah.
matter. They prefer it that way. But you see crisis. You see the explosions that are happening. Black Lives Matters. You have all these protests in France,
Sure.
in Brazil, all around the world,
Definitely.
in Sri Lanka recently.
Yeah.
They overthrew their government, but then gave the control back to a new
That's
government.
right.
But they
Private
literally forced the
practice.
president to flee. How do
That's
you?
right.
Because it's the leadership of the working class. The working class is ready to. They're ready to move heaven and earth to actually change society. But it's the leaders at every step of the way say, you know what, we got it from here. Go home. Go home. We hear you. We'll give you some reforms. Vote for new leaders, and that's it. And
Yeah.
that is the moment of which they lose all of their leverage. And that is the leadership that Lenin and Trotsky were talking about. It's the Revolutionary Party, the Bolsheviks at that time in 1917, that was able to take the conditions that were happening and recognize that they need to overthrow the corrupt provisional government that didn't resolve
Mhm.
any of the problems of the Tsar. That's the same thing that needs to happen here, is that
Yeah.
aren't the labor unions? We had a rail strike that got averted, by
I
the way.
saw that.
There was no rail strike. The government came in from
I
both
saw
parties
that.
that basically said, you know what, you don't have a right to strike. We may give you some verbal accolades that we support your right to strike, but when push
Yeah.
comes to shove, we're going to take that away from you. You have nothing to do. You can't do anything about it. Otherwise, we'll send the military in. Like that's what that law was, and it was supported by both Democrats and Republicans enthusiastically.
Yeah.
From
Yeah.
Joe Biden, who was quote unquote the most pro-union, pro-labor president in history. That is what Marx says is a true nature of capitalism. Is that in the final analysis, the bourgeois are just the state is just the committee for the bourgeois to manage their
Correct.
affairs. They came together to manage their affairs. Doesn't matter if you're Democrat or Republican, doesn't matter if you're liberal or Tory. They came together and said, you know what, we need to protect business interests. We need to make sure goods keep flowing. So you don't get your sick days. You don't get to strike. And guess what? The labor unions at that time gave in. They said, you know what, we can only do so much. We can only do so much. We got the best we could do. That is the crisis. The crisis was, why wasn't that labor leadership fighting to go all the way? Why
Yeah.
weren't they fighting to go for a general strike to not only link up the rail workers' demands, but link it up with the demands of the teachers, of the
Right.
Starbucks workers are trying to do?
Yes.
Why don't they do that? The reason why they don't do that, because they don't want to do that. They got a
Yeah.
nice gig. You know how much it pays to be a union president? It pays 6 figures. It's nice. It's a nice job.
Collaborators. They're
They
collaborators.
don't, they're exact. And that's exactly what Lenin said. Class collaboration, right? Class collaboration. We'll get you a good deal. Don't worry about it. How? So they don't want to go beyond the limits of capital. They may lose their privileges. They may lose their nice job. They got a nice pension. They got kids to put in college. They don't want to go on strike. So they convince the workers that this is the best that they can do. So our perspective is we need to build an organization. We need to build enough of a critical mass that the workers will be done of being constantly betrayed by their leadership and saying, you know what, how come you don't fight for us every time you want to fight back? If you won't fight for us, we'll replace you and we're going to go on strike and we're going to link up those strikes, right? That's the crisis, is that the leadership is trying to keep this lid on every single time. And they play a huge role in preventing the class struggle from going further, preventing a revolution from being successful. In Sri Lanka, why, if there was a Bolshevik party in Sri Lanka, a modern revolutionary party, they would have said, don't go home. You literally forced the president to resign. You are partying in his presidential pool. You have literally all the power in society. What the labor leadership in Sri Lanka should have done, but they weren't going to do that, is say, we need to generalize this. We need to have all workers in all industries join us to go on strike. Begin to form your own neighborhood and workplace committees. Elect delegates to a new Congress. Do not give power to a new president, a new general, a new Congress. We have the power. We won't go home. We will begin to build our own institutions of self-governance, which is what the Soviets were, which is the Russian word for council. which is that is the basis of the Bolshevik Revolution, was that it was the beginning of the councils, of workplaces, of the army barracks, of the actual individual peasants and the workers there, forming their own committees that elected their own leadership, that united around their own needs and said, you know what, this is how we're going to administer ourselves, and we're going to be united on a federated platform, and say we don't need to give power back to the Tsar. We don't need to give power back to the provisional government, which refused to end the war in World War I, refused to end the Russian participation in that war. That is the crisis. There isn't that leadership. There isn't that willingness to go beyond the parameters of capitalism. And we need to build enough of a critical mass in every single country to go beyond that, to generalize the workplace struggles into a general strike. Why don't we have a political general strike? You want to fight for Black lives like we did 2 years ago? There should have been a call to go on strike. That's how you shake the capitalists. That's how you send them into a fear, is if the labor unions took their forces and told their workers, we're going to go on strike for Black lives. We're going to shut down the ports. We're going to shut down factories, shut down warehouses. That's how you fight back against police violence. That's how you prevent Black. That's what they're afraid of. But the labor leader doesn't want to do that, right? So that's why you ended up with a defeat. Eventually, the masses exhausted themselves. They can't always be in a sense of protest at all times. They went home. They elected Joe Biden. Things were supposed to be great. They elected Kamala Harris. Things were supposed to be great. And yet now what happened? Now the Democrats are saying we should fund the police. We should give them more money, right? It shows you that it's the leadership. Why don't the workers have their own party in the United States? Why do they have to vote for the Democrats and the Republicans? Why don't they advocate for their own party, to fight for their own class interests? So in a way, that's what's missing. That's what's needed. Otherwise, you're going to be in this place where we are right now, of crisis upon crisis. It doesn't seem a way out. And that actually gives us optimism. It gives us optimism because the ruling class knows they don't have any answers. That's why they're terrified. That's why they keep on rotating through so many leaders so quickly. Look at Britain. Look at UK. How many prime ministers have they had in 5 years? They went through like 10 of them. And that's what scares them, because Britain used to be the most stable capitalist country. And now
they railroaded Jeremy Corbyn in Britain. He should have taken him, and they pulled him down because he had all these like advanced ideas. The Green New Deal in America was supposed to like bring back like actual roads and bridges that need to be like fixed, homelessness, housing, like real world things that like, you know, the bread and potatoes, like kitchen table economics that need to be like addressed. And instead we're being devolved or pulled down into these other things so that we're combating each other rather than addressing these like top level things. And they're just satisfied from the top down to remain stagnant. And they're war pigs in a way, like they're just taking in all this stuff. And whether that war is economic or political, it's all divisive. So I agree with you in that sense. Moving on from that, I would say next, okay, that's really good. We've identified that. I'm someone who I will question, for instance, why do we have brick and mortar stores still? We could order and fabricate things. We could like print, whatever. I think a lot of technology is actually being held back in an industrial sense because it's not conducive to this like capitalist society in this world. It's ridiculous when we could, exactly. So what do we do when we finally figure out an abundance as human beings? This is one of the most abundant times in like in the history of our people, and yet we're working harder than we've ever worked. We're making more than we ever made, and we're resting the least we've ever rested. We're so stressed. We're so anxious. It's crazy, like as workers. So what do we need to like break through? Does it need to be an actual existential crisis? Do we need to like, do the wheels of production need to stop? Do we, you know, how do I envision some, not, it doesn't have to be calamitous, but it does have to be existential to the system that we are currently in. How do we like describe it in our minds as Star Trek fans to say like the Bell Riots, for instance, were a turning point and a watershed moment or whatever. And there are a lot of cultures in the Star Trek world that had these watershed moments where they moved, like the Vaudoir or the Bajorans would come to mind, of course, but like, how do we describe it so that it's not just, like in the real world, like of that we exist in, and in the Star Trek world?
Right. I think there is no final crisis of capitalism. Right. If there was a final crisis, then we wouldn't have to do anything. Then we would just let it collapse by itself. And it would be really easy. We would just let time and inertia do itself. But that's unfortunately not how history works. That's not how these things work, right? There has to be a conscious element of it, right? A conscious element. And the social revolution is arguably the hardest type of revolution to have because it requires a conscious awareness of the working class. Previous revolutions that have happened, required conscience only happen at a smaller level. A lot of these bourgeois revolutions were the last period of these revolutions. The American Revolution being one of them, right? Was the last period where we got rid of feudalism and you develop a different type of property relations. It was the beginning of capitalism in a lot of ways. But the social revolution requires a different type of consciousness. But that doesn't mean it's unattainable. I would say you just have to draw those connections and build people's confidence in, in a lot of ways, what they already know, right? What I mean by that, I mean in the sense that workers are actually really smart. They're smarter than all of the commentators give them credit for. People often say, "Oh, you're low information voter, college educated or non-college educated, white working class versus non-working class." All of these distinctions that are designed to make people angry, confused, demoralized, right? When in reality, there are more people in the United States. There are more people that don't vote than vote for the Democrats and the Republicans combined. Right? That in and of itself is a vote. The fact that they don't vote is a vote. The fact that they don't do that says all that you need to say. They see that there's not a dime's worth of difference between the two parties. That's why they don't bother to vote. No one talks about how that is actually a pretty significant development. It shows you there's a crisis in the institutions of bourgeois democracy, which is why a lot of these governments, they're worried about, no one respects Congress anymore. No one respects the presidency anymore. No one respects the Supreme Court anymore, because that's the illusions that have kept people in check for so long.
Agreed.
So explain to people, how do you get, to get there? I think we would say is, you're right. Aren't you tired? Aren't you tired of being tired all the time? Why do we work so much? So that's one of the biggest contradictions. I used to work as a barista. I used to work in restaurants and stuff. And there's so much food that goes to waste at the end of the day. Like, we prepare these trays of food. We have the ability to feed people great food, by the way, right? Like, Whole Foods, the Hot Bar, the Whole Foods at Wegmans, and these places, they create terrific food on a mass industrial scale. All that food, for the most part, if it's not sold, will get thrown away. The workers themselves will get arrested if they try to give it away, or they'll get fired if they try to take it. They'll just throw it away. They'll make it tomorrow again, and they'll throw it away. They'll sell what they can at profit, right? And pay their workers not very much. And then they'll pay the workers not very much to throw out that same food to then make it again the next day, right? That is one of the most central contradictions. It's like, wait a minute. You literally have produced food. We have a surplus right now that's produced every single day. The technical ability to feed people is not that hard. We already figured it out a century ago, really, right? With the productive forces, to make sure that everyone on this planet does not starve, does not have a caloric deficiency, has enough water, has a roof over their head, they don't die of exposure, and have like basic medical care, has been solved on a purely kind of scientific, technical know-how. We've already done it.
Sure.
But it's not profitable to actually do it, which is why there are so many people that die of starvation, die of malnutrition, die of exposure, die of thirst, right? You have to rationalize people like, wait, so actually this is a good thing. It's a good thing for the economy that some people have to really just die. And then you have other people that don't just have their material needs met. They are scandalously wealthy, extravagantly, grotesquely wealthy, right?
Yes.
So much of that energy of culture and society and media and politics really is devoted towards explaining why this grotesque distortion should exist. And in fact, not only should exist, it's just, it's correct, it's the right way to do it. And most people know that in their bones. They know that at the holidays, they know that we need to help the needy, we need to help those less fortunate, we want peace on earth, right? They know in their bones that that's true, but they are convinced, or at least somewhat convinced, by the large cultural and educational and political institutions that that's not attainable. The best you can do is just write a nice Christmas card at the end of the year and donate to your local food. That's all we can do. What else can we do, right?
I'm reminded of the scene in again, I come back to the Bell Rights, past tense or whatever, where the Bashir and Cisco first arrive in San Francisco. They get picked up and they think they're dims, and they walk in and they're walking through and they're saying, how could they have given up? How could they? And they just couldn't picture this world. And I'm 41 years old now. I'm seeing the world in my 30s. I saw crazy things in the 2010s. We were, rah, rah, rah in the 2000s. And then the 2010s just became this tumultuous thing, just watching on the world stage. And we're trying to picture a way out. I think we've all been like hoping, sorry, my hair is just crazy now, to picture our way out. But that cynicism, again, to come to your point, is poisoning. What are you going to do? And it's become, as you said, like choosing the lesser of two evils, until you have these slow gradations away from a society that passively cares about its common man or the common good, right? And you said it's just. They think that it's just. You need to throw away that sandwich. I think I heard of like a store that like cut up its clothes before they like threw them in the bin and stuff. That. So there's this huge gargantuan waste that's happening in the Americas, let's say, and in other cultures as well too. To me, it seems like social Darwinism, like a eugenicist sort of idea that like you can only have the bourgeoisie crazy classes if you have a crippled poverty class. Because if you baselined everyone so that they were well fed and had a basic education, they could think their way not only up those classes, but to destroy that system.
Correct.
Indefinitely. And so it seems insidiously intentional. I don't know if that would you agree or disagree with that?
It is. It absolutely is intentional. And it goes back to the idea that's exactly, people can only be so grotesquely wealthy if people are also so grotesquely poor. Like the two are directly related to each other. Goes back to the idea profits are the unpaid wages of the workers. It literally is tied in that connection. How do you break that? So I think something that's sometimes not understood is, and I'll eventually tie this back to Star Trek, because I know I'm talking a lot politically, but it is tied back to Star Trek too, is time. Like time is actually one of the most central pivot points, central fulcrums out of all of this, is that that's how capitalism continues to exist, is that right now, at this stage of capitalism, there's really no more productive, there's no real development of the productive forces anymore. You actually have a crisis of overproduction. You produce more stuff than we really truly need. And we certainly produce enough for human necessity, food, shelter, medicine, water. We produce more than enough of them. There's overproduction in other things too. And then we try to spend millions in advertising, get people to buy stuff that they don't really need in order to justify itself. So it's really a crisis of overproduction. But yet, because there's a crisis of overproduction and there's no development of the productive forces, the only way that the capitalists can really extract any type of profit anymore is either through speculation or continuing to squeeze the workers through austerity, meaning that you need to produce more with less. So you work even longer. You work multiple jobs. And in fact, we don't give you any benefits, right? Everything is all gig jobs. Everything is Ubered and Lyft and DoorDash to hell now, right? Everything is just atomized, right? That's the only way that's the only way capitalists can still somewhat gain their quarterly increase in their profits, right? Even though that's actually comes with a cost too. The cost is social instability, as we're seeing right now. Now imagine if we actually worked less, because that's where technology and the productive forces, technique, human knowledge comes in. we can actually, and that's what automation, if it's under workers' control, should not be feared. In fact, if it's under workers' control, it means liberation on some level. What does that mean? It means you're liberated from the fact that we have to devote so much of our time, energy, and labor power to producing things we need to survive. So that frees up time. That frees up time to do
Yes.
everything, all
Yes.
sorts of things. It frees
Leisure.
up time for leisure, exercise, art, culture, just to be free. All of those things that we see that in Star Trek, that they
Yes.
don't seem to be crushed by a 9 to 5. They don't seem to be crushed by side gigs. I don't see anyone Ubering on the side in Star Trek. In fact, they have a lot of time to, especially in Next Generation, let's learn a dead language. Let's learn an ancient language. Let's take up archaeology. Let's go, join a play and
Yeah.
really get into it, right?
Yeah.
And it's development of the culture, right? Like, and even just
Yes.
even the lower deckers, in a way, like have
Yes.
time to, I don't want to say indulge, but actually fully live creative lives, right? Because they have time to do those things, and it's amazing, right? And it goes
Yes.
back to your earlier mention that sometimes the bottle episodes are one of the best episodes
Mhm.
for exactly that. They go on an adventure, they go to the holodeck, or they learn some problem that they have to resolve a problem together. Something
Yes.
something that's a slice of life, or something learning about someone's culture, or all those types of stuff. Learning to be more human, learning
Right.
all those types of stuff. Those are often the best episodes. Those character
Agreed.
buildings, right?
Yeah.
That's enabled by the fact that they don't have to have a subsistence living. They don't have to live paycheck to
Right.
paycheck. They don't have a
Correct.
paycheck. Right? They
Yes.
don't have rent to pay. They don't have to work weekends and holidays and nights. They don't have to do that, right? And it also begs the question: if you had more time and you actually equalized literacy and you equalize human actualization, education, and development, then you could actually have the quote unquote lowliest person also be in a position to actually run the administration of society. And that's what Lenin was talking about when he wrote that with a drastic shortening of the work day and a drastic shortening of the work week, a cook can and should become prime minister. It's only when you have no time, it's only when you have scarcity, only when you have these limitations, that
Mhm.
you have a bureaucracy that emerges, that puts itself above society.
Yes. A
You have the
bureaucratic
emergence of a
class.
police force that needs to monitor and keep control of the food lines, that keeps
Yeah.
control of the hungry people and sick people, right? They need to keep them in line, right? But if everyone had the ability to participate and freely discuss democratically and plan in all that type of stuff, that's how you actually get to that type of society where you have the full participation of the working class, right? That you don't have someone above another that can enforce their will upon you, because
Right.
that's often how it's done in the society. You need to do this because you need to eat, right? So I need to do what you tell me to do, and if I don't do that, you can shoot me or put me in prison, right?
Yes.
You have control over me. But if you eliminate those conditions, which is class distinctions, class antagonisms, then we could freely associate or freely dissociate. We can actually participate in the running of society, right? So
Mm.
in a way, the Star Trek society is like that, but it's also contradictory too, because it's also not a perfect representation. But it shows you
Yes.
that you have more free time to produce creative endeavors. Um, you have more time to do all sorts of stuff. So art and culture would flourish under socialism and communism. You wouldn't have the same Marvel movies over and over again, the same recycling of the same thing, right? You would have
Yeah.
the development of culture on a fundamentally higher level, right? Right?
Yeah.
How many art? Stephen Jay Gould, who wasn't a Marxist, but had the beginnings of a Marxist understanding. He was a well-renowned scientist. He said, he was asked once, like, "Aren't you concerned about, the next Einstein, where the next Einstein's going to come from?" And his response was like, "I'm concerned about not just I'm concerned about how we don't see Einsteins or even um, greater intellects that are greater than Einstein every single day, because those people that would have developed their scientific capacity and scientific ingenuity were dying. They died either in a sweatshop, they died in an industrial accident. There are so many great scientific minds out there that we don't even know ever existed that could have surpassed someone like an Einstein every single day, because they were just one of the many people that died every day under the current system. Like, he didn't say it in those types of words, but that's what he
Yes, yeah,
was
yes,
saying,
yes.
which is
I'm
actually
very
like
familiar with the quote, actually. He's an
incredibly
evolutionary biologist. Yeah.
right, and it's incredibly like it's moving, it's stirring. It should
It
stir you
is.
to just complete anger, because it's true. What he says is absolutely true. And so that's what we mean. It's like, imagine if you actually could free people from
Yeah.
just surviving. What couldn't we do? And then
Reminded
reciprocate.
of,
Yeah, go ahead.
sorry, go ahead. I'm reminded of what Shatner, very recently, he went up on the flight or whatever, and he came back, and I haven't read the whole thing, but I've heard him say it. He's like, at 90, I'm having this like existential crisis. He's like, I went up and I saw the Earth, and it's like, it's the same experience that a lot of astronauts have, which is when they go up and they see that it's one big blue marble, and they're like, there's no borders, there's just one people, it's just one big enormous like biosphere, and we are cutting lines. And I'm gonna shout out to Mo here for Etienne Balibar, who was a philosopher we knew, came to McMaster and promoted a world in which there were no borders, that they didn't exist. Very controversial at the time, and he filled the rafters with philosophy students who wanted to come and see him, because it was so out of reach for people. They could not imagine a world without nationalism or identity in the same way. Like, if you're born in one place, why does my passport say born in here, and I'm treated differently because I'm born here, or my ethnicity is here, or I speak these languages, or I have these associations? So to speak to that point about like no borders and stuff like that, and that crisis of finally realizing that we're one world, can only really be done in a leisurely way. You have to have time to travel, to see the world, to see other walks of life, to appreciate them. We're fostering environments and cultivating them in which we have these feedback, sort of echo chambers, whether it's on Facebook or in types of media, whatever, where people are affirming like this confirmation bias, right? Of like, oh yeah, I'm right because I heard it here and all this stuff. And so that echo is making us dumber and wronger, but making us fiercer in the way that we are clinging to those things. And so what I would put to you in that vein is that until we decouple, I think, from the modalities of communication that affirm our biases, we won't grow. Like, we're stagnating as a people, as you said. Like, we're the means of the production, we're overproducing and whatever. COVID really put like the gas to the flame of like how little time we actually need to dedicate to work. I know over here on this side of the world, we're going to a 4-day work week nationally, and it's they're doing it in Japan and whatever, and it's working. I already have a 4.5-day work week. In Sharjah, they're doing a 4-day work week. Every experiment they've done it, and Andrew Yang, he had this thing about UBI, but he like sensationalized it. But it should exist already. We should be subsidizing leisure. Even Ford knew it. He went to the 40-hour work week because he realized you can't work them to death. They need to leave, have a weekend so they can buy your things. And for him, it was a selfish thing. What I'm saying is that until we realize and go beyond that cynicism and have some sort of optimism for the future, we can't envision it. And so I'm super curious as to how you're not picturing the exact path to that future, but in a society of abundance in which we mismanage that abundance, how do we get to a future in which that abundance was a background thing?
Yeah. I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is a crisis of the leadership of the working class. Is that there's a layer of the current leadership that of nonprofits and trade unions and what have you, that just say, you know what, we got it. You don't have to struggle. We'll advocate for you. There's an entire industry of it, and it's insidious because they'll say we fight for the same things you do. We fight for the same things, but in a way, they just become lobbyists. They become just another layer of careerists that don't want to go past capitalism. They don't want to empower other people to challenge them because they're a good intermediary. They're the leaders of the working class. They're the thought leaders, the influencers. They got a nice job, you know, and it's difficult because those are oftentimes ones that say that the allies of the movement, right? But that is what's holding it back, right? And as Marxists, we understand that the workers already know, and if you give them the ability to do it, they can actually run and manage their lives. They just need the means to do it. They need to not starve and be hungry, and
Yeah.
you know, be actually, you know, nourished to do it, and actually and able to be literate and have education. But if you give them those means, then we don't need this entire layer. It becomes an industry, right? The nonprofit industrial complex, the, you know, the in a way kind of woke capitalism, or, you know, even companies now are trying to be like, oh, we're thoughtful about how we, that's, it's all a game to basically confuse people, to say, you know what, the current relationship of capitalism is good, that we as long as we kind of give lip service to a lot of these social justice type um, um, endeavors, then you don't have to challenge the structure of capitalism, right? You don't have to you don't have to challenge the boss, because the boss understands what you're doing, and we can just have swap out the figureheads. They're more diverse now, but the figureheads are still based off the same economic basis, right? So you can't. So that's why you have what's happened with the 2020 protest, is that there was a push to have more diverse oppressors, right? Just elect, more diverse CEOs and hedge fund managers, and diverse, military generals and diverse police chiefs. That will solve the problem. And that's, again, just a fig leaf as to fundamentally what is at the root cause of all of these types of stuff. That needs to be combated. You need to say that's actually, you're holding back all of the struggles. You're holding back the true liberation of humanity. It's kind of the idea of like rainbow washing. A lot of banks now are saying they're very pro LGBT rights, but this is like business for them, right? They'll say the same
Yeah, it's
thing.
identity stuff. Yeah.
And you have to fight against that and say, you know what? No, the real fulcrum in society is we produce everything in society. Like, not a light bulb turns on, not a wheel turns, nothing moves without the working class. That is tremendous power that the workers have. You could shut things down.
Yeah.
That's what you need to be able to explain to people, is to galvanize them to say that on that basis, you can actually reform society. It's happened in the past, but on the basis of your labor power, everything gets done. But without that labor, nothing gets done. That's tremendous power. Use that power to actually begin to reorganize society. How would you do that? What if you had more time to participate in local councils, in regional councils, in neighborhood councils that
Yeah.
elected themselves up? You had the immediate right to recall your representatives. There wouldn't be a standing army. There wouldn't be, the workers could arm themselves to defend themselves if necessary against capitalist repression, right? These are fundamental things that people understand, but when push comes to shove, they'll be convinced to just trust the leaders, to be like, you know what, we've heard you, we hear you, just go back to work, go back to school, go back to producing, consuming. We'll take it from here. We'll hold new elections, we'll write a new constitution, whatever you want to get you off the streets. We'll kneel, like everyone was kneeling, like Colin Kaepernick when the protests were happening. Everything to confuse, to get you off the streets. But it's that moment where you're supposed to take it and generalize struggles. Every
Yeah.
workplace should be going out on strike and support these movements.
Yes.
So that's how you get the optimism, because there will be continually to have this movement in society. You'll continue to have more and more of um, these struggles, because none of the contradictions have been resolved. So the Star Trek future, in a way, is only done through struggle. It's only done through kind of that class confrontation, not class collaboration. Deep Space Nine is my favorite Star Trek, although I like all Star Trek. It's the only Trek that, although it's confused too, none of these shows have perfect politics, and I don't expect them to. How could they be? But they provide a useful tableau to explain,
Yes.
at least with Deep Space Nine, that struggle is required. It's not necessarily sitting down at a conference table and just walking each other's shoes. It requires struggle, right? And that's actually what's needed here, is struggle, but struggle to victory as well. And that's how you can also explain, I think, to kind of go full circle to what your friend said. Well, is United Federation of Planets even worth defending? Like, is it sort of evil? Like, isn't it sort of like this? And having a Marxist understanding of dialectics and contradictions, you can understand that the United Federation of Planets is actually worth defending, but it actually requires a rejuvenation as well. It requires a complete social revolution, right? The the United Federation of Planets is actually very similar to a bureaucratized form of the Soviet Union. That's how I analyze it. Obviously, it's not really here nor there, but my own personal headcanon, that's exactly what it was, in the sense that there's a planned economy. People's needs are met. And on
Yeah.
that basis, that material base of a planned economy, the Soviet Union is worth defending. But there is a bureaucracy that emerges, that puts itself above the workers in the Federation, but also in the Soviet Union, right? So it required another political revolution to complete it, in the sense
Hmm.
that, so after Stalin and the bureaucracy solidified their control, it became its opposite, right? So the councils, the Soviets were no longer in control. The revolution was isolated. It became its opposite. In the same way, the United Federation of Planets, there is kind of like Starfleet bureaucracy. There are some
Yes.
bad admirals. There's a Section 31. How do you explain that? Like, that seems messed up. It is messed up. So how do you explain that? Do you throw everything out, or you say all power to the lower decks? Is that, or all power to the Federation Soviets? Like, why don't the star bases go on strike? Why don't the starships go on strike? Why don't the crews elect their own senior staff? You don't see that in Star Trek. It's
Right.
always top down. It's always like, we know best, down with see. But like, you see elements of that sometimes when Picard bucks orders, or Kirk bucks orders, or Cisco, or Janeway. They all do, right? Star Trek 3 is a classic example. Like, they literally like go on mutiny. They steal the Enterprise.
Yeah.
Great
Yeah.
movie.
Yeah.